Hi, I'm Ikea, and for today's video, I want to have an in-depth look into the Blacklisters exotic knee pads. This extra addition onto the climax of Year 7 Season 2 came as a little bit of a surprise. I wasn't expecting them to add an extra exotic on top of the Tempest that we were going to get from that anyway, as the Tempest, of course, had some issues upon introduction of this season, and because of that, we already had them in spades. But now, alongside of that, we're getting these Blacklisters. In this video, we'll go over how to get them, what they do and what they are, and then also go into some of the calculations for this. Calculations-wise, of course, it is a pretty simple item. It is a 20% amp on top, but we'll especially compare it to other choices we can make, and of course kind of look especially at the opportunity cost of this, as of course it comes with a hefty downside as well. Then we'll take it into some gameplay and see actually how usable it actually is, as I've had some ups and some downs in some gameplay, and situationally I definitely think they are usable, but I don't think the new meta is here with these. But yeah, let's go get started. And let's first start out by discussing where we get the Blacklisters from, as this is an additional reward for the climax mission alongside of the Tempest. The Tempest, of course, at the start of the season had a little bit of a kerfuffle. It was available from the previous season's Manhunt mission, and that was just due to its item ID actually being the exact same as the Tinkerer upon the release of this season, just a typo. And because of that, wherever you could get the Tinkerer, you could also get the Tempest. They locked down that mission and they added this instead, the Tempest, to Summit Floor 100 as well, just to let people have access to it, not in a super easy way, even though it is very cheesable. But yeah, a lot of people, because of that, already did have the Tempest, and because of that, they wanted to add an extra incentive, an extra reward to do the climax mission, even though for me personally, I always do them anyway, because they're part of the story and it's a new thing to do. But they added in this extra exotic on top of that. And of course, what that means is that we get it from the climax mission. It is the same traits as generally is for just the climax item as we normally have, but now we basically just have two of them. And we get it from the Tidal Basin Pact mission. To get access to that, we first need to do the high value targets of the scouts. We don't need to do all of the scouts. We just need to do the squares as they are here. So that's week 4, week 7, and week 10. Each of them is basically capturing a control point, doing the stronghold for that faction, and then doing a quick bounty. So they aren't too long to do. You can get it done in an hour or so. You don't need to do the other scouts, and actually it's recommended to not do the other scouts and save them for weeks when the stretch goals are up, because yeah, they give a decent amount of season XP, and because of that you can actually just save them for those times. And yeah, you can find the story through other means, as other people will go through and actually open those up. That way you gain access to this Tidal Basin toggle, and you can go do the Manhunt mission there. Keep in mind that there is 2 Manhunt missions there. Be sure that you're not doing Hornet and that you're doing the Pact. And upon first completion of Master on each character, it is a guarantee that you get a Blacklister and a Tempest, as always with those climax missions. But there's also a drop rate chance on below, and it seems to be the same 1, 3, 5, 7, 10% that we see for other items, and 7% being on Heroic and 10% on Master alongside of the guaranteed completion. Of course, to gain access to Master as well, you need to do the mission once on a difficulty below Master, so that can be their normal, hard, challenging, or Heroic. You don't per se need to do it on Heroic, but it can be a good training way of getting through it. This mission isn't too hard, especially because this season's modifiers are really strong. With a decent enough team, you can just power your way through. If the team is less decent, adding in, for instance, one support in the way of a healer, or for instance, a foam eclipse, and then just being a little bit slower, but being more consistent, can actually make all the difference. And honestly, this especially because of the modifiers, is not too hard of a mission to get through. Zealot can do a lot on this kind of missions. And yeah, upon completion on Master, you're guaranteed to get one. That is honestly the best way to do it, especially for the time being where you can't find teammates. In the future, trying to solo these missions are definitely set up, all of the master missions are definitely set up for group settings, and because of that, they're a little bit harder solo, but not undoable. But you could also, just farm heroic for a 7% chance of either of these. And then let's go to what the Blacklisters is. Here, an exotic kneepad with the flavor text, screw that one guy in particular. Although that's not per se in line with actually what it does, but I do like that line as well, as I use it quite often. Here with the core attribute being red, and then the attributes itself being crit chance and crit damage. Fixed to that, of course, there is no blueprint for this one either, as most of the gear from the climax missions, even though they now have added in for the Tempest, they added in blueprint, the gear seems to still go without, and that's kind of fine because we get them and we can just optimize them up. It needed to be kind of this, where we have a red core and crit chance and crit damage, because any missing piece here of the puzzle, especially for a piece that's kind of set up for damage, would be detrimental to it, and we would basically have to deduct that from whatever the talent had. So this way, it is the way to kind of go, but that also means that it is very much aligned to crit builds. This isn't per se in here for, let's say, headhunting builds, or for instance, skill builds or such. I do hope maybe in the future we get something similar to this, but then for skill builds, but I'll leave that to the conclusion part. Here, as the talent of it is Ostracize. Shooting an enemy applies a mark. Only one mark can be active at a time. The mark disappears after 15 seconds or when the marked enemy dies. And then we receive 600% amplified damage from the marked enemy, deal 20% amplified damage to unmarked enemies. And effectively, that's the mechanic of this. We shoot the first enemy that we shoot, we apply a mark to. That mark will stay for 15 seconds or till the enemy dies. And then we basically shoot other enemies to deal 20% amplified damage to all the other enemies. Upon seeing this on the patch notes, the instant question became, well, what can we mark? Because especially if we can mark things that can't even shoot, then yeah, we can have a decent uptime on this without a bad downside of it here. This 600% amplified damage is exactly that. This basically means also that anything that was chip damage, even more so than glass, where glass, for instance, makes it so that without glass, basically snipers and explosions basically take you to health kit, and you have to really watch out for those. But if an SMG enemy, a rusher, let's say a Riker rusher is rushing you down, you can't survive them for a few seconds. You can take a few hits. They basically do what I call chip damage to you. They just chip away at you. They will eventually get through you, but it's not in a single hit. Taking glass already makes those kind of enemies a little bit more dangerous, especially, for instance, if you have a minigun warhound where you need a little bit of time to kill them, but they're just, laying into you. When you're running just Obliterate or such, that doesn't feel that horrendous, but when you're running glass, it does. This is 10 times glass. This is 10 times perfect glass. And in this point, basically as well, and some people have gone like, why is it this humongous of a number? It's basically a number just humongous enough to make anything basically a one tap to health gains. And that means that you really need to watch out for what you mark, and if that marked enemy is shooting at you, even with, let's say, an SMG blind firing while suppressed, they are still very dangerous and deadly. Now, of course, the aforementioned health gate is really our mechanic then, same as with when we're running glass, that keeps us upright. We basically have a health gate, then we have a revive 5, then we have another health gate, and then we die. That is amplified here with this incoming amplified damage. We just really need to watch out for what we mark and how much damage they deal to us. And there is, of course, also ways of mitigating damage, especially, for instance, within the season, when what does it matter if they do 600% amplified damage if I can have more than 100% damage reduction through Zealot? But yeah, mostly it was a question of what can we mark? And we kind of have the answer to that, and we'll see so in the gameplay sections. I'll be definitely going into that. And yeah, if only one enemy remains in combat, the mark disappears and cannot be reapplied. So once we're down to the very last enemy, we can't mark them because of that. They don't do amplified damage to us, but then also we don't get the bonuses or such, because also there is no this amplified damage is only to unmarked enemies. So that means that there needs to be a marked enemy somewhere for us to have an unmarked enemy. So basically, once we're down to the last enemy, basically all of this falls away. And that means that we would, for the last enemy, we'd be better off with just a brand bonus, of course, which would be active at that point. So we kind of have to really discuss this in its uptime, and that will come into play into the gameplay sections of this. Let's go over onto actually how it works for a second and then onto the numbers. And for that, let's come here to the range where we can show that how it works pretty easily. So we have the mark. Once we have the knee pads equipped, the first enemy that we basically shoot, we get the mark on them. And yeah, this enemy now deals 600% amplified damage to me. If I shoot them, I'm not doing any extra damage to them. The only extra damage that I do is to unmarked enemies. So if we mark this enemy and it stays up for that 15 seconds, if I then go and shoot these guys, I'm getting 20% extra against them. This also then means that once we're down to 0 enemies and we can't have a mark up, basically, the talent is completely useless and gone. So on the last enemy, we don't get anything. And this is in stark contrast to the overdogs, actually, where on the last enemy, it'll always be active. It'll always be in the right tier because there's only one enemy. So yeah, you can't be in the wrong tier. And yeah, that is actually pretty detrimental to it. This also means that for a single target, if we're going around, let's say, and we want to do some hunters or such, or for instance, in fights where there is just one enemy, or you're fighting 2 rogues, and on the second rogue you don't have this bonus. Yeah, it kind of hurts, and because of that, that already eats into its general usability. But it isn't too hard actually to just mark an enemy and then shoot something else. But that still means that instead of just sitting here and just laying into this enemy, I can't. I need to mark one enemy and then move, and that by itself already is going to be a little bit tedious, where for instance with the overdogs, or for instance Coyote or Tinkerer, we can have a much more easier time. And I think that will actually be the thing that a lot of people will find that they don't want to do in general play. But I do actually like it for its mechanic, because it is at the very least interesting. We want to shoot one enemy and then go to different enemies to hurt them instead, which isn't a natural thing to want to do. And that's the kind of items that I actually quite enjoy, where they just feed into playstyle and just make you want to play in a slightly different way. And yeah, that 600% amplified damage is kind of illustrated here well. For instance, of course, yeah, none of these targets shoot back, but if we can put that mark on something that doesn't shoot back, and then we go and just unload into other people, yeah, then that is the dream, of course, with this item. And it turns out in gameplay, depending on which factions you're fighting, you'll have a bunch of ways of getting that done. We'll see so in the gameplay sections. Let's actually move on to the numbers. And for that, we'll come to this trio of multi-calculators in the spreadsheet. I'll, of course, link to the spreadsheet so you can go and look at it at your own leisure, and just also, double check me and keep me honest, because sometimes there are mistakes in here. And for those that maybe have seen the Overdogs video recently, they will see kind of the structure that is here and realize that this is a copy of that one, and it is. Here, of course, the Blacklisters from a damage side of things is just at 20%, where the Overdogs is at 30%. We really need to look at it more in the same way as with Overdogs in gameplay, and what the uptime really becomes of that 30% for the Overdogs and the 20% here. But we also do need to know is what the opportunity cost is, and how much ahead or behind it is versus the things around it that we could slot in as well. And yeah, that is the core of this. First, we'll be looking at it versus different exotics without introducing any weapon talents or such. But then, of course, we'll need to also compare it to the Tinkerer, and for that, we need weapon talents in there, because that's what the Tinkerer does. It effectively takes a weapon talent and basically makes it a gear talent alongside of the main talent that you would have. And the reason we have 2 of them here now instead of the one we had for Overdogs, actually with the Overdogs one, I kind of made a mistake. We used the Lexington actually as the base weapon for everything, which of course can't be that way for the Tinkerer, because the Tinkerer doesn't work with the Lexington. But the Lexington is a little bit of an improvement over the FAMAS that we're taking here instead, and kind of correcting for that. But because of that, I also wanted to have one where we have one base weapon, and in this case, the FAMAS for everything. Because of that, yeah, we kind of need both. Because the Lexington is a little bit better, it'll be available again as well from the stretch goals. We'll start a little bit from this video. If we zoom in a little bit, I'll explain that these are multi-calculators of my design. I do have a video on my channel kind of explaining how to fill these in if you're very interested in, for instance, doing some of this yourself. And what these are set up for is to compare up to 10 builds. Input happens down here where we input the stats from in-game. And we take the weapon stats and slot them in here. And what we especially get out is a mag damage, a burst DPS, and a sustained DPS, and percentages to compare them against. Together with that, we also get some checking numbers here to check against in the game. And of course, I have done so and just made some checks here and there to make sure that this aligns with the reality of the game. Because generally, if there's a mistake in here, then these don't align. And yeah, we check for that, of course, always as well. And we also have the build multiplier there and some notes over here. If we then start actually looking at this one, where we have the Blacklister in 2 incarnations here with 60 crit chance and 57, we're having both because setting it up for 60 means taking 3 crit damage mods on the weapon, which isn't actually available for all weapons. So for instance, the FAMAS only can take 2 crit chance mods. It doesn't have the long underbarrel rail to take 3 crit damage mods. So it does kind of matter. The optimal way to kind of set it up is to hit that exact 60, especially as well. We have Obliterate here on the build. And if we're taking on top of that, for instance, Killer and such, actually it is very beneficial to set it up at this 60 crit chance here. Then we have a 57 variant just for the other side of things if we are just being lazy with it, which I find myself quite often doing, so that's why I do include this one, where I just take that same 3 crit chance weapon that I would use, for instance, for the Coyote version and such, then I take a Tinkerer, for instance, with a crit chance mod, or for this case, for instance, I would stick in a mask, in the mask slot, just a mod, or for instance, flipping a mod, basically, from that 51 that we kind of have still set up from the Coyote age. And then we're comparing it here with the Coyote in 15 to 25 and 0 to 15 incarnations. We have the Overdogs, of course, and then Bloody Knuckles as one of the also great damage dealers. Then we have Exodus, Nimble, and Little Rugged, kind of stand-ins basically for just not having a damage component. All 3 of these are actually very usable exotics, but they, of course, are utility. They provide us either, for instance, healing in the form of the Nimble or just survivability in the form of the Exodus, but they don't have a damage component. And we can kind of see what that basically means for in comparison to this. Then we also have Centurion, both in its one half, which is much more burst related, and then in its other half, which is much more sustain related. If we look first at the Blacklisters, we have it here at the very one that we're comparing against as inactive. So if we're just shooting the enemy that we've just marked, if we're just, not doing the thing of the build, or if we're shooting the last enemy, of course, as the last enemy is not going to be bonused in any way of a fight. Then if we actually look at how much it is when it is active, surprise, surprise, it's 20%. This is actually important to still double check, as it could be that it is unintentionally something else than just a separate multiplier. But here we kind of see that, when it is active, and of course, I've checked the checking numbers in the game to make sure that it is so, is that, it is a 20% increase when it is active. We'll especially be looking at all of these in kind of their optimal ways. So mostly the 60% is the one to kind of look at. But if we actually kind of lay it up in the lazy way, so to say, we are leaving a little bit on the table, but it isn't also humongous amounts. It is important to note, actually, that we are looking at this with 20% headshot rate. As of course, this headshot rate, the headshot going into the same pool as a crit does effectively. It means that if we play around with this headshot rate, that actually does shift that number, as especially the crit difference between the two is a little bit, but it isn't humongous. I will see there we go from 19.81 to 19.87. So between those two, it doesn't matter too much. But against the Coyote, it actually does. Where if we play around with this number, I'm going to first actually set this to 100% rate. We see actually that the Coyote, because of that, because it is a crit increase instead of a separate multiplier, the way that these are, at its worst incarnation where we're just doing 100% headshot, even in the right range, it's just a little bit under 7%, 6.75% there. If we set this up at 0% headshot rate, it reaches almost closer to 10%. So yeah, that headshot rate really does matter here. So when we're setting it at 20%, an average that I feel is gettable. Sometimes there are definitely ways of gaining more than that, but sometimes also you're shooting something that doesn't have a head. So we're just taking that as a guesstimate for general play. We see here that the Coyote is generally between, what we have here is basically a 5 to 10% increase. And that is generally what we could say the Coyote is. If you're in the wrong ranges set up for it, then you're doing 5%. If you're in the right ranges, you're doing around a little bit less usually than 10%. But we can round it up to that. That is, of course, just less than, for instance, the Blacklister when it is active. The thing is, though, that the Coyote is effectively always active. At its worst, it's just at 5%. And then at its best, it can reach up to 10%, especially depending on the build. An always active and consistent damage bonus can have its values, of course. Here we do have a little bit of control on how active this will be, but not fully either. That last enemy, again, it's just going to be unbonused in any way. And that's the big difference as well with the other one here, which is the Overdogs. And of course, the Overdogs, it can be set up basically in the same way with that same 60% crit chance, and then it has a 30% amp instead of the 20%. The thing is, though, that we don't per se have that much control over the Overdog's bonuses. The bonuses, though, overall, I would say now, generally, the meta, to me, kind of is between Overdogs and Tinkerer for instance, Red Strikers or just Red builds in general. Overdogs, though, just because for general play, a lot of the enemies are within the tier that is always basically bonused against, you will, most of the time, work up to be at least more than the Coyote. And then depending on talent choices, generally more than the Tinkerer as well still. But situationally, it can perform very poorly, especially if you're taking it into situations like the raids or the incursions, where situationally you just don't have the enemies there to make it work. And yeah, that is the thing with the Overdog's comparison to the Blacklister as well. As yeah, there's been a lot of talk, of course, between the two. There is some control that we have on the Blacklister that we don't have on the Overdogs. And that is kind of the balancing reasons as well, why they've put it up in that way. We don't really have control over the Overdogs in a lot of situations where with the Blacklister we can have. But we have to really, in gameplay, kind of decide what that actually means, as both of these, of course, really stand or fall by their uptime. And Bloody here, same way, kind of, but Bloody is total weapon damage, even though its descriptor says, or its description says, it is weapon damage. It isn't. It is total weapon damage. And we see that effect here as well, as we do have Obliterate here. Because of that, instead of the 25%, it's a 20.83% that it is here. If we were running a Chest Striker, it would be its full 25%. So this one as well kind of really depends on what other total weapon damage talents we have there. And yeah, because of that, it can be less than the 25% than it says there. That's one of the reasons as well why more recently they seem to have gone with these separate multipliers where they can kind of guarantee that it's just that 20%. If we go up against the Exodus, Nimble, and Rugged, especially because they do have as well still the red core, the crit chance, and the crit damage, yeah, it's the exact same as basically when it is inactive. The difference, though, is that, yeah, if we're fighting just one enemy that we can't mark really anyway with the Blacklisters, you might as well have either Nimble or Exodus there to, you know, have that talent at least trigger if they get to you. For instance, with the Exodus's Cloud. With the Blacklister, of course, we're just not gaining that damage at all. Versus Centurion, the Centurion can actually outperform it on the DPS end if you are using it actively always in that DPS side of things. That does mean, though, that you're weapon swapping quite a bit and such. And actually on the sustain end, it doesn't keep up because it is a hefty rate of fire increase. That means that you'll hit your reload much more often. Because of that, actually, it'll keep up on burst, but not on sustain. And on the sustain end of things, though, then yeah, that is the inverse, of course, where we have that reload speed and the magazine size. That helps quite a bit on the sustain end of things, but not on the burst DPS side, where even up against basically the base or an inactive Blacklister, it is even behind there. All of these though are very well usable, and I think actually Blacklister fits in there as well. As Blacklister, yeah, it really, because we have some control over where we activate it against, or which enemies it is going to be active against, I think situationally we can really make this work, because it is still a hefty bonus. We have to remember that Coyote used to be our go-to, and that was basically at its best, at its peak, kind of, yeah, maybe an 11%. And yeah, we're pushing definitely much higher nowadays. And that leaves one major exotic to compare against, of course, but that requires a lot more to compare with, as we're going up against the Tinkerer here. Now, the Tinkerer really requires us to actually introduce weapon talents into the mix, because that's, of course, what it does. It basically brings that extra weapon talent into the mix. And yeah, we can compare that here, where we're taking the Blacklister first with a utility talent. That will be our baseline that we're comparing everything against here. But then also, actually, as a second one here, Killer, of course, as one of the core talents that we take quite often. We're comparing it on the side here as well, this burst DPS number against Killer, and what that means when it is active, of course. In this whole section, the Blacklister is just active for its entirety, and that, of course, isn't a reality of things. So we do need to remember that, yeah, we can lose 20%, basically because the Blacklister is inactive. If we look at, especially, yeah, the Killer, what the Killer adds on top here, we gain about 22% just from Killer when we are active with the Blacklister and Killer is active. This means, of course, this isn't on the first kill. We need to get a kill in first at the very least. The activation rate here for Killer is really high. It is into the 80%. And because of that, we see actually that, yeah, it is going to be quite often active. Sometimes, though, you still need a second kill to activate it, because even the highest activation rate doesn't guarantee the activation. But in general play, we can get a Killer to go, and yeah, that is especially here because we're losing a little bit of crit in comparison to, for instance, if we went Coyote and such, it is actually even a bigger bonus than we get from the Coyote. Then we have also Streamline and Measured as two other big talents, of course. Here on a build that is pretty high on the weapon damage end of things, yeah, it's not going to fare well for Streamline in comparison to Killer, but of course Streamline is going to be always active, even if we raise, but at the cost of not using our skills, which to me is usually a big price to pay. That's also why I always include Measured as just kind of a very consistent talent that doesn't require much. We just shoot the enemy, and on average we gain about a 10% increase here on the burst DPS side of things. If we then go to Tinkerer, where we could take Killer plus Streamline, or Killer plus Measured as well, especially Killer plus Streamline, the Streamline and Killer being the two big ones, of course, it almost catches up to when it is active, of course, with both Killer active and then Blacklister active, but yeah, it is still a little bit far behind. The thing to remember, though, is that we have a little bit more control over Streamline, for instance, because also we have this toggle here to toggle off that 20% of the Blacklist, of course. And if we're, for instance, have Killer active and we just are running Streamline as well, that versus just Killer and then Blacklisters being inactive, we are, of course, way far ahead, of course, now. That's also why we kind of have to discuss it in the nuances of it, because yeah, we have a lot of things here that, you know, we could have this active or that active or such. And yeah, I would recommend just playing around with this, and maybe, yeah, you can copy this basically to your own Google Drive and play around with it if you want a much more in-depth look at it. Here, though, we'll, yeah, especially look at, for instance, Killer plus Measured, which is around an 11% still over the utility variant here. If we're comparing it against the Killer variant here being active, both of these, of course, require Killer to be active, but here we have basically Measured versus Blacklisters. And of course, Blacklisters, as we saw, is at 20%. This Measured by itself is around the 10% here. And unsurprisingly, we're basically 10% behind if we go this route. But this is, of course, a pretty consistent. Measured, we can say, is pretty consistent. Killer, we get kills quite a lot. At least that's kind of the point of red builds. You are trying to get a lot of kills going. And you can have a decent uptime on this 10% that it has over basically, yeah, if we had, if Blacklisters is inactive. Because, yeah, if we actually just also to show that inactivate Blacklister, basically a lot of these talents are either about 10% or more ahead of it. For instance, here we see Measured is close almost to 10% with a 9%. So it again really comes down to how often can we have this active, which is the crux of this whole discussion, of course. The thing though with Tinkerer as well is that we can take actually, and that's what I find myself kind of going with, for instance, although even though here it's not just utility, because if we take killer plus utility as we have it here, we are of course quite a bit behind, because basically we're now with this setup equivalent to the Blacklister with just the utility there as well, so without the killer, and we need the killer to kind of catch up to it almost. But that utility can be pretty useful here, where we take, for instance, fast stands and such, and we can get fast stands pretty consistently going, and then killer active. Our sustain with fast stands would be, of course, yeah, much better, because our reload would go down, so our sustain would actually be much, much better than, for instance, we would see here. But then again, yeah, activation time of killer and such kind of comes into play a little bit. But of course, yeah, the same would be true for Blacklister there. Overall, though, one of my go-tos has been, for more recently, is just taking, for instance, yeah, Tinkerer plus Killer, and then having fast hands there, which doesn't provide damage. And the thing is, of course, also for this season, we didn't per se need that much damage. We had the modifiers to kind of carry us. The main modifier was already a lot. We could always put Sanitation or Zealot or advanced material on top of things and do even more damage. But next season, of course, that'll fall away a little bit again, as we've seen kind of what the modifier for next season is going to be, and there doesn't seem to be that huge of a damage component to it as we've seen with some of the seasons. So likely for next season, damage will become a little bit more of a premium thing to go for, and then yeah, and we might lean back towards this. Then this whole section. We had the Blacklisters with the Lexington, and then the killer and or the Tinkerer side of things was with FAMAS. Now that of course is also detrimental for the FAMAS, especially on the sustain end. The FAMAS doesn't keep up with the Lexington at all. On the burst end, it can kind of keep up, but then the Lexington still has much better handling and such, which yeah, it has some value there. But of course, Lexington isn't always available. To keep it a little bit more easily comparable, because the base weapon then is the same. Here we're looking at it with the FAMAS for all of it. There though, we see that yeah, all of the basically Tinkerer side of things kind of catches up a little bit, and especially on the sustain end, because yeah, now we don't have that very big difference between the Lexington and the FAMAS going on. It is important to kind of include this, but the damage differences are basically that 1.5% that the Lexington has on the FAMAS, and we see that result here as well. The killer variant is kind of catching up a little bit, as we see here. As yeah, in here it was behind by the killer plus streamline. For instance, if we look at that, it was behind by or it was 16% and 11%. Here it is going up into the 18% and the 13%. And that makes a difference. But yeah, of course, it depends really what weapons you have available to you. If you don't have a Lexington, the Tinkerer might become a little bit more of a thing to go for, because yeah, it can push out a little bit more damage there. And again, the real difference is that these play differently. We have to consider that extra damage incoming, and we have to consider that uptime. After all of these numbers, let's actually go and look at the actual important thing of this, which is in-game play, and to actually show it in action and kind of discuss it in actual play, because again, that is where this will stand or fall. How useful is that damage bonus? How detrimental is the downsides? And of course, yeah, does it compete against other things, especially on uptime or such? Here, we're coming up against the control point, and I have also the seasonal modifiers on, because of course, yeah, as we discussed a second ago, what does damage increase matter if I can negate all damage incoming? And I'll be abusing that here, of course. Yeah, let's get going. I see a patrol or a convoy also coming in. I'm gonna actually do the dumb thing. I'm just gonna go in with Zealots, and yeah, I'm gonna mark this enemy, and of course, yeah, a full damage reduction for the little bit at the start of it. And yeah, that means that I can kind of, with impunity, deal with some of the enemies here. Of course, that immunity goes away, but there is other ways as well that we can kind of mitigate that even without immunity. My immunity is about to end, although actually I just in time got a kill. And yeah, we do need to watch out what we're marking, especially. Because yeah, the enemy that is marked, they will, they will of course be a lot stronger against us. They're crowd controlling again. I've marked that enemy, so I'm kind of going after others as this card finally makes its way down to me. And yeah, that was the guy I had marked actually taking action against me and putting me down really quick, of course. They are really strong, and there again as well, actually. That timer had run out. I put it on this enemy as they were about to shoot me, and yeah, I had a really bad time there as well. And that can be the big downside. We have one lady not wanting to come down. Understandable, as they have RC cars. I would do the same. I would not try to go up against somebody who just murdered all my friends. You know, this being the last enemy, it isn't the last enemy of the engagement, because I engaged that that convoy incidentally, accidentally. So we do need to watch out. That enemy will still get marked. And then yeah, here we have actually these guys. And these actually will help as well to kind of illustrate a point, which is that we have things like rushers. That rusher will take quite a long time, and that's also why I was going for hyenas here. They will take quite a time to get to me. And even when they get to me, they will be not super effective if I, know how to move. And that does mean that, yeah, we can actually abuse that a little bit. So again, I'm going to mark the rusher, and I'm gonna go after these enemies. And yeah, of course, that pissed them off. And then the last enemy again will not be marked. Again, rusher hitting them, going after the others. And that 20% does feel pretty potent here as well. I'm running it with a full red striker with that knee pad there. I'm running it in the 57 crit chance variant because I was lazy. But still works well enough, and as we saw from the numbers, we're giving up about 1% there. I'm gonna call in our reinforcements and actually do the defense here real quick as well. With the miniguns, everything is transitive, of course. Our striker stacks and such even apply to this, and yeah, we can, not our weapon talent though, but for the rest of it, yeah. We can mark, again, a rusher. And that rusher, again, will take quite a while to get here. And that's the thing about with this, is, yeah, finding enemies that you can get the mark on that aren't dangerous. At least not for a while. Because yeah, that rusher will eventually make it to me, but actually, by the time they make it to me, I will likely be, I will already likely be out of, well, with 15 seconds will be done. And of course, kind of, if we are using a minigun like this just to lay into enemies, yeah, it's not too big of an issue. And again, they are the last enemy, so the mark drops, and they didn't do their 600% because, of course, I would have been health gated instantly if that was the case. So it is somewhat workable. The big downside is still, though, that, for instance, yeah, in comparison to the overdogs, where the last enemy is guaranteed marked, here it's the inverse. The last enemy is guaranteed not marked. Here we see also that this is range limited, so that enemy didn't get marked there because actually the other enemies are too far away as they got into combat with my reinforcements, and they were actually too far away to be counted for the mark. The mark does seem to be in that same 100-meter range. I'm kind of in the kerfuffle of this, and this is the bigger downside here. This is the enemy I need to fight. There is other enemies over there, but that means that the mark will still happen. This enemy has 600% against me, and I don't have any bonuses against them. This is where this feels really, really bad. Now, the thing to do there, though, is to have a Banshee Pulse, or foam, or some form of crowd control. And especially if you're fighting with this, and you're fighting in, let's say, doing legendaries alongside of a foam eclipse or something, yeah, you can kind of use that as a thing, of course. But yeah, without, here specifically, I went without it. And yeah, of course, again, what we can abuse, here being the last wave, and I have Zealot, and Zealot will last long enough. I'm gonna actually go in here. I am gonna actually mark, although what we killed there, but yeah, I'm gonna mark there. But actually, in that time that I took to mark that enemy, with, let's say, something even like a coyote or a tinker, I would have just killed the enemy in front of me, of course. But it's kind of down to this season's modifier and such being super strong as well, so even though here I don't actually have that big of a bonus to it, even though still likely sizable, but yeah, on this character actually I don't have a map that is mostly green. But there we saw it kind of in action and some of the things that you have to watch out for. So we ran into an enemy that was close to us while the other enemies were far away, and yeah, we had to mark them, but then yeah, we don't have the bonuses against them. One way I feel that this could be helped, and as kind of like a balancing factor to it, it would be nice if we had some damage, less than the 20%, definitely, but some damage against the enemy that we do have marked. Even something as low as 5% might mitigate that downside of it when you just don't have a choice and you're in aggro with something very far away, but you also need to fight something really close by. Overall, though, the thing with it is as well, overdogs there would have been easier to use. Most of the enemies we were fighting, outside of the engineers that we encountered and the shields, all of them would have been the tier that overdogs is always active against to begin with. All of those rushers, all of those assaults, we could have just mowed those down with a 30% amp. And that's kind of the thing here. I feel actually overdogs being a little bit overtuned makes this less of a viable pick. I also don't feel that it's a problem for this piece. I just feel that the overdogs is maybe too high and could maybe lose to stand at least 5%. Let's take it up against some True Sons, where we also actually have a similar thing as the rushers here, something easy to mark. And let's indeed take it up against some True Sons here, as they also have a few things that we can mark. So for instance, in the Hyenas one, especially those rushers were really handy to mark. Cleaner rushers have the same, but actually the other factions rushers we generally don't want to, because actually usually they're not that much of an issue. For instance, with the True Sons, with that shotgun kind of coming towards you, when they get close they become annoying, but from long range especially, yeah, normally they're not an issue, but when they just one pellet can take you to Healthgate, yeah, it is an issue. One thing we can do as well, foam canisters in general, have also a thing where they can actually act as weapon damage. You may have noticed this for instance, you can actually, for instance, with a high headhunter stack, if you direct impact with foam or a fire cam or whatever cam, you can actually kill the enemy that you hit with the canister. Does a little bit of damage, and that actually works for this. So for instance, here we have a sniper. You can actually hit her with a foam. As we see, she is marked now. Also, she's foamed. And also she's, in this case as well, pointing the wrong way. The thing, especially with foam, to remember is that it isn't something that will last forever, first of all. But also enemies will quite quickly start to shoot out of it. I'm gonna do it again as well. Just gonna do that guy. I didn't actually notice that there's a... the wall kind of continues on there with the door here. But yeah, we can kind of use that. But then the True Sons also have those engineers. Let's go find one actually. And having found some here in No Hope Hotel, let's engage this. The True Sons engineers have that turret, of course. The turret that they put down has an ammo box on it, so we can actually abuse that a little bit. The question with all of this also becomes, is this more useful as trivia or actually useful? It is actually handy, but the damage increase of this isn't, especially in the cost that it has against other things, maybe not worth it. Because yeah, we could here as well. With overdogs, we would have bonuses basically against a lot of these enemies. But here actually, I'm gonna actually destroy both of these ammo boxes on this. We're gonna kill the enemy that we had marked earlier. Although actually the mark ran out on time anyway. But especially using, for instance, yeah, tactics to, for instance, crowd control an enemy so that they can't actually, you know, do that and decimate us because they have the mark. Is actually kind of, yeah, important, of course. You know, as well, I'm kind of talking and playing and not paying too much attention. And of course, again, we can just, for this season at least, zealot our way through. So here I'm gonna actually try to break this guy's backpack, but I fail miserably. But those immobilizers have the same trait as well. We can kind of immobilize them, especially a red will stay immobilized for quite a while. And we can, if I actually hit the backpack there, we can use tactics like that. And that enemy, of course, for quite a little while will be disabled, and I have my 20% against everybody else. Purple like that will actually not break out of his foam at all, and I can even abuse him to get a little bit of a zealot back there. You see, there's a whole army coming this way, so let's quickly get through this. And again, for the last enemy, I don't have that bonus against this name, whereas that's exactly the point where you would want those kind of bonuses. But yeah, at least with Striker, then we're stacked and such, so that's kind of making excuses for this item. Here we have 2 patrols coming in, so let's actually deal with this before we flare, because otherwise this will turn into hell. Kind of looking for who I want to hit. Here we have a bunch of reds and purples and elites even. So I'm going to mark one of the elites, especially because I expect them to go for cover. Generally, when you assault enemies like this, what will happen is that especially elites will go for cover first and then engage. Reds will just start shooting, as we'll see here as well. So when I shoot that guy, we see all the reds are just kind of just standing there like dumbasses and shooting. And that is how their AI is set up as well. Kind of in the same way as some players are, of course, where they just start anyway. I started blasting as their first tactic, and others that are a little bit smarter than that. Now, a medic is also a really good target for this, of course, because the medic will likely go for the revives and such, and not be per se too concerned about shooting me until I really lay into them. And that does make a difference. So learning the archetypes and such for this also matters. But then here, another tool we can use is just distance, especially when doing the defense. I'm going to go get some ammo because I am a little bit low. But while doing the defense, the enemies will be starting from far away. As we saw with elites, elites are mostly trying to close the distance before really engaging, unless I really engage into them. So our hive is almost back as well. We'll just take this engagement. I didn't, our zealot is off of cooldown again, so we can reuse it. But here, these elites, until I really take shots at them, will not really they'll take pop shots, but they're mostly concerned about closing the distance. So while they're doing that, I'm going to mark that medic again. That medic is the least likely to engage me. And in the meantime, I'll deal with all of his friends. The mark did end there. I'm just going to mark and kill because he's just out in the open. But that's the downside of it. The uptime of this is, while controllable, is not that easy to manipulate most of the time. Now, in group settings, I found as well that while it is a little bit easier because there's more enemies and more things to shoot, there's also a downside to it, which is that other players are killing things, of course, as well, where you lose the ability to be as, here, for instance, I'm just shooting especially things I haven't marked and or trying to, at the very least. So yeah, there we see the downside of that marked enemy, where they with even just one tiny little pellet hitting me, or one tiny shot hitting me, it already completely destroyed me almost. Again, I'm gonna take that target as my mark target, a turret of which I've disabled the ammo pouch, so it can't fire. But then the annoying thing is, the engineer will go and repair it, and that will also actually make it so that it is a very dangerous target. Because turrets actually from far away, they'll just always be firing. And yeah, we see the downside of that again there. Oh, my hive though. Good zealot here. This is the last few enemies though, and not really worth it. Then we can see we can use some tactics. We can mark smartly as we can. For instance, using the foam actually to just mark enemies with that and they'll be CC'd for at least a few seconds, even for a full red here with just a few gradings on top. Our ensnare duration is 6 seconds. So we can actually kill an enemy or two likely in that time and then focus on that. And we see as well that we can use things like medics and turrets and rushers and such as priority targets where it might take a little while before they're in range to actually do this damage to us. And in the meantime, we can do the damage to others. What we also say is that if you have the marked enemy and they shoot you, it really, really hurts. It really, really does. And here in solo, I can have kind of perfect control over what I'm marking and what I'm killing. But yeah, in a group setting, it becomes a lot more chaotic. But that can also be a good thing, because what you can do is mark something that you basically aren't going to deal with, but something that might stay up for a little bit. Because if I mark, for instance, a heavy that spawns with a wave, and then kind of focus on the little things, even if my allies are kind of shooting the heavy and trying to focus it down, what might happen there is that, it'll always take them a few seconds. And of course, for instance, with Hyena heavies and Black Tusk heavies, what I can do is actually just shoot for the chain and disable them as well, to not per se be a dick to my allies, just to, keep that enemy up. But we can just shoot the chain off. They'll be busy with that for a few seconds. And in the meantime, we can deal with everything around. So there is definitely ups and downs to this, and there is actually one last place I want to just quickly highlight, and then we'll go to a conclusion. As one last thing I want to kind of discuss, but also here we're going to go for one of the most cherry-picked things we can do here. Come to Potomac Event Center. We've done a few rooms already. We've reached the points where we take out the boats, and this is actually the thing I think we'll find some places where similar actions to this will likely be possible. So here we have, of course, these two boats here. They are enemies by definition of the game. They have a health bar, a red one. We can shoot them. We can do damage to them. They can't shoot back, of course. They're just boats. So what we can do, for instance, here, but this is, for instance, the extreme hefty cherry-picking version of this, of course, is, we can just shoot the boat, and now we have 20% against everything. And unlike, for instance, the overdogs, we don't really have to consider what we're really shooting there, because everything is bonus 20%. And that then, of course, also then still means that we need to watch out for that timer, because that's actually one of the things as well that I find myself kind of being annoyed by is, especially in group settings, of course, other enemies die here as well. Once it doesn't actually consider the other boat as an hostile until we've aggroed this guy as well. But most of the time, this isn't, of course, an option, and that's kind of detrimental to it. Actually, weirdly enough, neither was showing the mark. I've noticed sometimes the mark does seem to break, and that's, of course, very annoying. Actually, here as well, while we're here, let's show the trick to this, because I see too many people getting down by this guy, but you just... it's very easy, just you have a crowd control part right there, and you should make use of that. But this is just to highlight that there will be places where we can mark things that are... not going to kill us, because they don't have the ability to kill us in any way. And actually, having played around with this for the last few days, both in its broken state and it's kind of, now it's unbroken state, I've noticed there is a bunch of places where we can do things like this, because alongside of some of the things we showed here, support stations are a very, very viable thing to shoot at. But then also, do you want to leave a support station up? The same is true, for instance, with the generators in, all of the master missions, for instance, but the most recent one. But do we really want to wait with destroying the generator just so we can have our marks up on there? That timer that it has as well, it is annoying that we don't really, unless it's directly in your field of vision, you don't really get a feel for it. I would have loved if there was a timer on our buff bar to kind of just glance down at, just so we can know when we're about to mark the next enemy. Because, of course, here, when I mark the boats, they're marked, but then after 15 seconds, that disappears. And now whatever I'm directly shooting at is going to get marked. And that might not be a target that I really want to have the mark at that point. If it's an LMG guy that then just terrorizes me for the next 15 seconds, that's kind of painful. But this is kind of the story of this item. So yeah, let's go into a conclusion and discuss it actually. And that is then the conclusion somewhat to this Blacklisters as well. As while it is very potent, that downside is a real downside, which is, as far as items go, balanced. And that's the issue for this thing, I feel. It is balanced where other things aren't. It really, especially in comparison to the overdogs, really doesn't have enough of a oomph to be worth using and also doing its mechanic. Because if nothing else, its mechanic requires at least thinking a little bit. With the overdogs, even, yes, if you actually think about it and do the things that it kind of wants you to do, you can actually squeeze out a little bit more out of it, but just using it in general has a decent enough uptime that, especially without any real downsides, really makes it work. I feel honestly the best buff that this thing could get is that the overdogs actually just goes to 25% amplified damage, which I feel actually it should have already been at, or maybe even less, but 25 seems at least fair for that. Then this item could actually be used in situations where, yeah, overdogs can't. And we have control here, where with the overdogs, again, we don't. But then the consistency of some of the other items is also a little bit closer to this one. And with its downside being so detrimental, I do enjoy playing with it, but I wouldn't pick it if I really need to go hard. Just because a down in, for instance, a legendary or something might wipe the team. And then I'd rather just have the consistent, let's say, 12, 13, 14% of an Tinkerer with Killer Plus measured than having this 20% that then might be detrimental in some ways. But I do feel there is definitely places where we can use this. I haven't per se looked into it much yet, but there are things, for instance, in the raids like Razorback and such, where we can mark them and then shoot other enemies that we already do anyway. Same could be seen, for instance, with Buddy and Lucy. If you're on Buddy, then, you know, you mark Lucy and just don't try to get hit by them and then have damage increases against Buddy. But then that's, for instance, also, again, a fight where the overdogs will just have its bonus up. So it is a very interesting piece, and I'm actually kind of, on board with its idea. Its biggest issue is that it is balanced in a world where there are some unbalanced things. But I could see that changing in the future, and then we could see some more use out of this. For now, though, I'll be using it here and there just because I enjoy the mechanic of it. You have to watch out for that one enemy that you mark. You can, of course, mitigate that somewhat by, for instance, as we showed here, making it a target that can't shoot back. You can make it a target that you maybe CC'd with a foam, and hitting them directly with the foam will then also mark them and kind of take out that step already anyway. We can, of course, as well, just CC them with Banshee Pulse and such. And especially with seasons, like this season where we have Zealot, for instance, we can kind of completely mitigate that. What does the extra incoming damage matter if we're not taking any damage at all? Same is true, for instance, yeah, if we have some strong crowd control built into the season modifier or through other means, or, for instance, if we are going around with reanimated or such, then, yeah, this can be a damage boost there as well. It is actually decently powerful, but yeah, its downsides kind of matter. And because of that, I don't think it'll be a general use item. But for very specific situations, this will be really powerful to use because, as we kind of saw, it is the bridesmaid to the overdog's bride. And yeah, it is definitely powerful enough to be used, especially if we can get that mark onto something that really can't harm us. But yeah, that brings us to the end of this in-depth look into these new knee pads. As yeah, they are actually pretty interesting. And while on the damage number side of things, it's just the 20% amp, of course. We know what that will do. We already had the metrics mostly from overdogs and just copying that over. The real question comes always with these kind of things on the uptime. And the uptime on this is actually can be better than the overdogs, but then also it has a really big downside to it with that 600% amp. The places where we can mitigate that, that'll work out fine. And I do think they have a place, but I don't think that place is in the general meta. But yeah, thank you for joining me on this video. Hope you did enjoy it. If you did find it informative in any way, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below. It does help out. So I'll do that a little bit of shilling as we are heading towards 10K subscribers, which I'm my mind is mostly blown. I am truly without words for that. And yeah, I hope to reach that, and actually, that will motivate me to do a thing that I've been meaning to do for a while and I've actually discussed in the past, which is maybe doing that call for backup, a podcast style concept that I've been sitting on for quite a while. But before that, though, we'll still go into those blue and yellow stats as one of the next videos. And also, actually, before the end of the season, I do want to do a tipping scales build showcase just to show what that can do. So yeah, I hope you join me for those. And as always, have a good night.